Welcome to The Explainer. I'm so glad you're here, because we are about to unpack one of the most widely misunderstood, yet absolutely pivotal conflicts of the entire 20th century. We're looking at the Soviet-Afghan War. This was a decade-long struggle that kicked off in 1979, and it didn't just devastate a nation, it literally redrew the global map. Using declassified archives and first-hand accounts, we're going to see how a supposedly localized intervention pulled the final threads on the Soviet Empire and set the stage for the world we live in right now. Okay, let's dive into this. Before we get lost in the massive geopolitical chessboard, we really need to ground this in reality. Just listen to this quote from a 22-year-old Afghan schoolteacher in Kunduz back in December 1979. "It was a Thursday in a cold winter. I saw aircraft passing by in the sky. What is going to happen?" I mean, just imagine standing in the freezing cold, looking up, and seeing the steady stream of foreign military transport planes scarring the sky. For millions of Afghan civilians caught in the crossfire, this wasn't some abstract Cold War theory. It was a sudden, terrifying disruption of everything they knew, sparking one desperate question: what is going to happen?
And that leads us to the central mystery we're going to solve today. The Soviet leadership honestly believed they'd be in and out of Afghanistan in a matter of months. Just a quick regime change, a little stabilization, and a swift trip home, right? So how on earth did a short-term intervention designed just to stabilize a border trigger the fall of an empire and completely rewire the 21st century?
Well, to understand the decisions made in 1979, we first have to look at the map. Let's get into Section 1, the crossroads of empires.
See, for centuries, Afghanistan hasn't just been a country. It's been a geopolitical pawn. Think back to the 19th century, when the British and Russian empires were locked in this tense, strategic rivalry known as the Great Game. The British were terrified that Tsarist Russia would push south right through Afghanistan to threaten their imperial jewel, India. So Afghanistan was basically forced to play the role of a neutral buffer state. Fast forward to the Cold War, and the superpowers essentially inherited this exact same geographic anxiety.
Afghanistan's strategic geography is absolutely vital to this story. We're talking about a country sharing a massive, highly volatile border with the Muslim-majority republics of Soviet Central Asia. It's flanked by Pakistan and Iran, but internally, it's defined by rugged, totally impassable mountain terrain. That geography made the Afghan people fiercely independent and historically basically unconquerable. For the Soviets, though, that shared border was a terrifying vulnerability. If Afghanistan became unstable, they were petrified that the instability would pour right over the mountains and into the Soviet Union itself.
Which brings us to a huge question. Section 2, aggression or desperation? What were the Kremlin's actual motives?
Let's look at how fast things fell apart. In April 1978, a Marxist party called the PDPA violently seized power in Kabul. They immediately shoved through these radical reforms that sparked a massive rural and religious backlash. By March 1979, a bloody anti-communist revolt erupted in Herat. The Afghan communists actually begged Moscow for troops, but the Soviets said no. Then, in September, things get even crazier. A radical Afghan leader named Hafizullah Amin assassinates his own president and takes total control. Amin's ruthlessness alienated literally everyone, and the whole country spiraled into total chaos. It was this rapid, terrifying deterioration that sent the Soviet Politburo into a full-blown panic by December.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how it completely shatters the Cold War narrative we were all taught. For decades, the West assumed the Soviets were executing this grand master plan to push down to the Persian Gulf for oil, but declassified Soviet archives reveal something totally different. The Kremlin wasn't looking at oil at all. They were terrified of Islamic fundamentalism spreading from Iran and Afghanistan right into their own Soviet Muslim republics. Plus, they were deeply paranoid that if Amin's government fell, the United States would swoop in and drop military bases right on their vulnerable southern border.
In fact, they knew an invasion was a terrible idea. Check out this quote from KGB Chief Yuri Andropov in March 1979, months before they actually went in. He's explicitly warning the Politburo against deploying forces, flat out admitting that Afghanistan wasn't ready for socialism. The Soviet leadership actually exhausted all the diplomatic options first. So that eventual December invasion, it wasn't some confident flex of military muscle. It was a desperate, panicked reflex to plug a perceived security hole.
But as we know, that so-called quick fix became a grinding 10-year nightmare. Let's get into Section 3, the Soviet Union's Vietnam.
The parallels to the American experience in Vietnam are just striking. You had the technologically superior Red Army quickly rolling in and securing Kabul and the major highways. But the Islamic resistance fighters, the Mujahideen, they completely controlled the countryside. And in Afghanistan, that's roughly 80% of the entire nation. The Soviets learned the hard way that holding the cities definitely did not mean winning the war. They faced this immense psychological toll of being a global superpower entirely bogged down by local insurgents. The Mujahideen would just retreat into those rugged mountains and bleed the Soviets dry with relentless guerrilla ambushes.
And the Mujahideen definitely weren't fighting alone. The international backlash was immediate. The U.S. slapped a grain embargo on Moscow and boycotted the 1980 Olympics. But behind the scenes, the CIA launched Operation Cyclone, funneling billions of dollars through Pakistan to aggressively arm the Afghan resistance. The real game-changer, though, came when the U.S. supplied shoulder-fired Stinger missiles. This literally neutralized the deadly Soviet helicopters and permanently shifted the balance of power up in those mountains.
Remember that geographical trap we talked about earlier? Well, it became the ultimate equalizer. Look at this remarkably understated Soviet military assessment from the time. They just quietly note the operational difficulties on the rugged mountainous terrain. That's putting it mildly. No matter how many tanks or aircraft the Soviets deployed, they simply could not conquer the geography. It was a snare trap, built by nature and fully exploited by highly motivated local fighters.
This prolonged stalemate had an absolutely devastating human and political cost. Let's look at Section 4, the domestic toll.
And this brilliantly illustrates just how horrific things got. A war meant to last a few months dragged on for 10 brutal years. Over 115,000 Soviet troops were deployed at its peak, with around 15,000 Soviet deaths and tens of thousands wounded. But the Afghan toll? It's almost incomprehensible. Between 1 and 3 million Afghan civilians were killed. The country was carpet-bombed, heavily mined, and millions of people were forced to flee into Pakistan and Iran as refugees. It was the complete shattering of an entire nation.
Back in Moscow, the political tide was rapidly turning. By 1986, the new reformist Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, publicly referred to the war as a bleeding wound. Think about what a stunning admission of failure that is. The Soviet state, which was entirely built on this ideology of strength and historical inevitability, was openly bleeding out in the mountains of Central Asia.
And that wound deeply infected the very fabric of Soviet society, mainly through the return of the Afghans, the Soviet war veterans. When these disillusioned young guys returned home, they were heavily marginalized. It's a tragic psychological parallel to Vietnam veterans returning to a divided U.S. Their stories of a brutal, pointless war utterly shattered the myth of the Red Army's invincibility. It created this huge fracture between the military and the ruling Communist Party. Plus, you couldn't hide the coffins coming home, which essentially forced the Soviet media to start telling the truth, directly sparking the early stages of glasnost, or media openness, that would soon sweep the nation.
We've seen the local devastation. Now let's zoom back out and see how this reshaped our modern reality in Section 5, the global ripple effect.
The war in Afghanistan didn't single-handedly cause the collapse of the Soviet Union, but it was absolutely the catalyst that pulled the final threads. I mean, the defeat proved the Soviet military was actually vulnerable. That directly emboldened the non-Russian republics to start demanding independence. When you combine that massive loss of prestige with the billions of dollars drained from an already failing centralized economy, the system just couldn't hold. The last Soviet troops left Afghanistan in February 1989. Just 2 years later, the entire Soviet empire ceased to exist.
So, the crucial point is what happened next. When the Soviets left in 1989, the United States largely walked away too, leaving behind a heavily armed, completely devastated country. The Mujahideen's victory over a superpower acted as a massive psychological boost for militant networks everywhere. In the brutal power vacuum of the Afghan civil war that followed, a fundamentalist group called the Taliban eventually seized control. And it was in this fractured landscape that al-Qaeda, formed by fighters who had originally traveled to aid the Afghan resistance, established a secure base in those exact same unconquerable mountains. They used that deeply isolated geography as a shield to launch terrorist operations worldwide.
And that brings us full circle to this lingering question. How did a localized intervention, ordered by a paranoid Politburo in 1979 just to stabilize a border, inadvertently destroy their own empire, devastate an entire nation, and forge the global security challenges that define the 21st century? It is a profound reminder of the law of unintended consequences and just how deeply interconnected our history truly is. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking questions and keep looking beyond the surface.